Welcome to today's talk on ordination and the church militant. We're going to be talking about what each of these terms mean very early on in today's talk. And there's a number of things that I hope you will know at the end of today's talk. And I'll run through these and I hope that we'll be able to say at the end how confident we are with these. So we'll talk about a definition for the Sacrament of Ordination. We'll talk about the purpose of ordination. We'll identify who can ordain and who can be ordained. We'll talk about when ordination happens, the ranks that people can be ordained to, 2 minor orders and 3 major orders, and the purpose of each rank. We'll also identify first steps in discerning clerical or monastic service. And then we'll also talk about the church militant. We'll give a definition for that, how that contrasts with another term that we have, and we'll see some ways that we can serve and describe how being part of the church militant will impact on our life. So, how confident do we feel with these questions? So if we can just hold up our hand with like 5 for I feel really confident about this, I know what's going on, all the way down to 1, I don't even understand the questions. How confident do we feel? Some of it, yeah. So we've got a lot of basic knowledge about this, but hopefully, what I'm hoping is that this talk will be bringing us 1 or 2 numbers higher for I think all of us, that we will be able to speak confidently on what is this sacrament, why do we have it, and what's its point. Sound good? Yeah. Great. A reminder, this is a catechetical level talk. So we're not going to be looking at going as deep as we possibly can on the I suppose deep as we possibly can could include a complete historical understanding of why the priest wears a belt. So we won't be going into all sorts of insane detail. We could, but that's not the level that we're looking at. We're looking at why do we have the Sacrament of Ordination in the first place? We're looking at the church militant as a concept. So if I've given you a foundation where if you wish you can go deeper, that will be a successful talk. And lastly, I'm sorry that all questions for the close of the talk. What I've found is that half the time the question is like 1 or 2 slides away from being answered. Please feel free to take notes, because I know that if I try to remember my questions, it's gone. So please feel free to take notes on whatever technology you would like to take notes with. All right, let's talk about the actual talk, the Sacrament of Ordination. We'll talk about what it is, why we do it, who can ordain and be ordained, and the church militant. We contrast this with something called the church triumphant. So the church triumphant, you have all the saints. If we walk into an Orthodox church and look around the walls, church triumphant. Or I should say, a sample of the church triumphant. We can start this list with the Mother of God and St. John the Baptist and the prophets and the apostles and the hierarchs and the martyrs, going on to the venerable fathers and mothers, which is the monastics, the unmercenaries, the healers, the fools for Christ, the wonder workers, the merciful, and the righteous. Now, they're categories of saints. And in the church militant, which is the focus of our talk today, in the church militant, we basically have 3 broad categories. We have clergy, we have monastics, we have laity. There's a lot of subsections in each of these categories, which is a focus for us. But that's the three categories of those that make up the church militant. Why is it that we say militant, by the way? We say militant because we're still struggling, we're still striving. We're still working to go towards Christ. We're still running the race. When the Apostle Paul talks about, I have run the race, I have finished the race, I've finished in faith. he's talking very, very close to the end of his life. The church triumphant are those who have run the race. The church militant, us, are those who are still going. A great difference there. We talk about church hierarchy in terms of rank. And perhaps we shouldn't, but it is what we use. What it doesn't mean is any concept of better than or higher than. I suppose you could say that this isn't the military. So we don't have sergeants versus corporals and so on. Instead, what we do have is that everyone has a role. All have the same role in one sense. All have the role to be set aside from the world, to be saints. This being set aside from the world is where we get words like ecclesiastical or ecclesia or anything with ecclesi at the start, probably comes from the same root, which is to be called out of. And so all of us, as members of the church, have this role to be set aside from the world, to be set aside not for what the world wants, but for what God wants, to be living for that world. This happens in the baptism service. I think it's specifically the chrismation part, but within the baptism service. Now, it is self-evident that some will undergo this sacrament and then not live up to what they've been set aside to do. This is both self-evident and, well, each person is responsible, but we have been set aside. We have been set aside for sanctity, for holiness, for heaven. This being set aside idea includes all within the church. That includes clergy, monastics, laity. Monastics do this in a particular way. They are respected for this way and the benefit that it brings to the church at large. That is prayer and refuge, most notably. But this concept includes everyone, not only for those people over there. A subset of those set aside are set aside for a purpose. So where monastics are more engaged in the act of repentance, even that's imprecise. They are set aside specifically for repentance, for that lifelong drawing near to Christ. Whereas in a way that most laity aren't, where most laity will find themselves in a community, in a household, in one form or another, monastics normatively find themselves in a larger community that is more separated from each other. We aren't expecting to have the kind of closeness that we find in families in a monastery. It is related, but quite distinct. Some of these set apart are additionally set apart to be, long and short, clergy. Set aside for the benefit of the community, set aside for the body of Christ. All are held to the expectation to be saints. It is true that clergy are held to a particular standard. There are, for example, ways that clergy can be defrocked, where laity would be able to continue as they are. Nonetheless, clergy, while being clergy, yes, are held to a particular standard, but all are still held to this expectation, this future, to be saints. Now, most Christians are not clergy, as you know. Service happens through many different means, many different gifts. The nature of the service is different. So for clergy who are set apart, who are set aside for clerical service, this is lifelong. It is expected that this will be for the rest of your days commitment. Whereas most other commitments are finite. We'll talk later about service in various parish ministries, and service in each of these is finite. Someone who serves in a particular ministry can say to whoever their responsible person is, I'm not able to continue serving. And, well, that's, we'd rather not. We do like people to be serving, but if someone decides they don't want to serve in a particular way, then, of course, this is honoured. But for clergy, it's lifelong. It is lifelong that a person who, even as a reader, the expectation is there that the service will be for the rest of their life to the end of their days. There is a structure to our clergy. We start with the minor orders and then go to what we call the major orders. And because it happens sequentially, we will discuss it sequentially likewise. So we start the first minor order that a man will go on to when they are ordained is to be a reader. And after a reader is subdeacon. There were other orders in the minor orders historically. We don't have them now, is the really short story. If you want to look them up, go right ahead. But for right now, you'll find readers, you'll find subdeacons, and then you'll find the major orders, deacon and priest and bishop. Within each of these major orders, there's different titles that you might see. So one can be a deacon, and one can be promoted to protodeacon or archdeacon. You may find priests, you may also find archpriests, mitred archpriests, protopresbyters, hieromonks, and so on. And likewise for bishop. You'll find bishops, you'll find hierarchs, you'll find those in the episcopacy, means exactly the same thing. And you may find those who have been further awarded, the archbishops, the metropolitans, the patriarchs. But each of these are awards. Each of these are awards within that particular order. So in one sense, there are ranks among priests. And you'll see this when, for example, there's a concelebration of the clergy in our deanery. Everyone knows who's standing there and there and there and so on. And yet, at some level, all priests are equally able to celebrate the sacraments. You don't get super special communion because you're a more highly decorated priest. And likewise, all bishops are able to ordain. You don't get super ordained because you're ordained by a patriarch instead of a bishop. The purpose of ordination, as we've said, is to set aside specific people for a specific sacred task, a specific sacred work, to make each of these orders. And each clergyman, minor, major, doesn't matter, is set aside for a particular parish. Each clergyman is assigned to an altar. The closest to an exception is the bishop. Even bishops are rectors of parishes. They are assigned to a cathedral. But we would more think of them as being assigned to a diocese, that administration of a collection of parishes, and to a landmass. And yet all are assigned to an altar, because being a clergyman means to be serving. It means to be serving not at large, but a defined group of people. There are some unique elements in the sacraments of ordination in our church. Firstly, ordination remains the property of the church. That is, a clergyman who leaves the church is also leaving behind their ordination. Secondly, that ordination happens within the liturgy. There's no special rite of ordination that can just happen apart from the consecration of the gifts. The only exception for this, and it's very uncommon, is to be making a reader. But where you have service at the altar, then you have always, you have the liturgy. I'll just note something that may be helpful the next time you're at an ordination. it is a common custom that the newly ordained will be wearing white on the day of ordination. So recollection of baptism. It also serves to highlight them for the rest of the service. But that is a very common custom in our liturgical tradition. There are, as we said, requirements and impediments for clerical service in our church. A candidate for clergy must be a number of things. He must be a good Christian, an example to their community, knowledgeable about their faith, willing to serve, and no doubt more. There also exist some impediments in our canonical tradition, things that would prevent someone from being ordained. There are things like vital statistics, so to speak, as we used to call it. Age and sex, any physiological deformities may be included here that would prevent someone from serving. A person's marital status is included, where if a person wishes to be married, then they would not be able to be ordained past reader. It's sometimes a little confusing, and when I was reviewing this, I was asked a number of times to change the way that I express this, so I'll read it directly from my notes. A married man is able to be ordained. However, once a man is ordained a subdeacon, he cannot subsequently get married or remarried. So this is a potential impediment. Other impediments. So it would be a requirement if the man is married, then they would need to be married to an Orthodox spouse. They would not be able to be remarried after baptism. And there are other impediments as well in particular life choices that are also a part of the potential impediments for ordination. There are some requirements that can be eased, though even this is exceptional. And we should note that there is no right to ordination. At no point is there the suggestion that ordination is going to happen. Even a seminary graduate does not have that right to ordination. And just lastly, one should never go bishop shopping. To go, well, he'll accept this and he won't, so I'll go to the one who will accept this, on the basis of that. It always ends poorly. And so one should not go bishop shopping. It's a temptation, never goes well. Let's go through each of the orders in their turn. A reader is the first of the ordinations. A reader is set aside in order to read liturgical texts in a specific community. That can include the Old Testament, that can include the epistles, and it can include any of our liturgical books, things like the Horologion, the Octoechos, the Meneo, the Lenten Triodian, and the Pentecostarian. Also included in this ordination is an ordination to serve at the altar. The normative place, the usual place where you'll find a reader, most often, is in the choir. Some readers choose to serve in the altar, but I think it would be the case that usually you'll find readers normatively in the choir. They may also be appointed to lead reader services as well. A ordination to reader, I suppose, doesn't give one the right to do anything more. They are put into a place, they are ordained for a purpose, and yet we know that many people read liturgical texts. We know that many people sing in the choir. I suppose the one thing that that ordination to reader gives would be the right to wear a cassock. And so it's this notion of being set apart that someone ordained a reader will be developing. This structure of ordination, it normatively happens in the center of the church prior to the liturgy. A man will receive a blessing to wear a cassock. They'll be led to the bishop on the day of the liturgy during the hours. So it's even before the liturgy starts. That's a distinction between the minor orders and the major orders. The minor orders is connected to the liturgy, but just prior to the liturgy. And so during the hours before liturgy, they'll be led to the bishop. There's a prayer to make them a taper bearer. Then they're tonsured. That tonsure, we sometimes hear the term tonsured a reader. It's technically incorrect. A man is tonsured in order to be a clergyman. Tonsured clergy, and then the prayer prior to that makes them a taper bearer, which means that they can hold a candle. And then another prayer after that tonsure is what ordains them as a reader. Anytime you see tonsure in the life of someone, it's a radical course correction of life, because you're making that offering from yourself. The hair is a symbol, I suppose, an icon of your offering of yourself. So that it happens for monastics, it happens for clergy, and it happens for each of us at baptism. A massive course correction in life. After these prayers, the reader reads a completely random reading. And by random, I literally mean the bishop goes through and flips through and goes, that one. And then it's given to the newly ordained to read in public. At the end, the bishop gives an admonition. That is to say, you've been made a reader. Be diligent about your service. And then the bishop announces to the parish where the reader will be serving. Typically, this is not a surprise. Typically, a reader will be ordained for their particular parish. But nonetheless, this is announced, and then that's the conclusion. Most ordinations are about 10 minutes or less. It's not a lengthy service, and yet it is a point where a person's life fundamentally changes. What happens then if there is no reader? And we'll go through this for each one. I was asked the question, so what difference would it make if we had a person in a particular role? And I think that that's a really good question, and answering that question will also tell us the impact of having that person, someone in that order. And so in the absence of a reader, laity may be given the responsibility to coordinate who will read. So we may have a schedule for who reads the epistle, or typically the person in charge of the choir will be able to say, right, you read this bit, you read the next bit, and so on. But coordinating reading typically gets deferred to one of the laity, and that's the major impact of not having a reader. Next, a subdeacon. Now you're all quite familiar with how a reader looks. A cassock, and then when in services, a sticharion, a robe on top of a cassock. A subdeacon will have the cassock, the robe, and the crossed orarion. And they'll have that for the entirety of the service. The subdeacon's role, what they are set aside to do, is to serve in the altar and to assist in any altar task. And this can include touching the altar table. Prior to that point, no altar server, not even reader, is permitted to touch the altar table or any of these sacred items connected with communion. A subdeacon is, however, and so they're able to do tasks that are connected with that. Things like changing vestments, a subdeacon would be able to do. They really come into their own in episcopal visits. When we have a bishop here, it's typically the subdeacon that would be tasked with making sure that everything runs smoothly in the, shall we say, complicated rubrics that occur in a bishop's service. Their normative place is the altar, and of course, just like every other clerical rank, they're able to perform the roles of lower orders. This structure of ordination, very, very similar to being a reader. It happens in the center of the church. There's a prayer that's made to make a subdeacon. You'll notice there's no tonsure. A prayer to make a subdeacon. Then washing the hands of the bishop occurs at this point, And then later in the liturgy, the subdeacon will wash the hands of the bishop again, and we're done. That's the ordination of the subdeacon. So what happens in the absence of a subdeacon? Well, there are some roles that can be given to altar servers. And so where a subdeacon would typically be tasked with holding the candles at a bishop's liturgy, those 3 candles and 2 candles and so on, these roles can be given to altar servers. However, other roles, any roles that involve touching the altar table or touching any sacred items, these would need to be given to major order clergy, whoever the priest or the deacon is typically. At the diaconate is where we transition to the major orders. Deacons are set aside to lead the prayers of the faithful, to assist the rector, and to be the bridge between laity and priest, and, if we're really honest, between priest and even altar servers and minor clergy, where the deacon is to be that bridge. Their normative place is the altar or the ambo, that raised platform at the front of the church. So you may have seen from visiting other churches or from photos and videos that the deacon will be there, orarion raised, leading the prayers of the faithful. The diaconate in the Orthodox Church is a much higher office than what I've seen elsewhere, where a deacon can be a term given to someone who's just working or serving. The diaconate in the Orthodox Church is highly respected, is addressed. If you're going to write a letter, then it would be the Reverend Deacon such and such. In personal conversation, we would say Father such and such, just as we do for priests. Their primary service is liturgical, and there's a lot for a deacon to do. In our own parish currently, we don't have a deacon serving here, and so this means that we don't see what we're missing. But if we go to other parishes where there are deacons, or if we look at live streams or videos, then we'll see that there's plenty. There's plenty that a deacon is doing that the priest isn't. There's a spot in the middle of the liturgy where the priest is the main speaker, and the deacon is center stage for much of it, leading prayer, allowing the priest to be praying the prayers in the liturgy with full focus and full diligence without worrying about timing. There was a deacon I respect said to me that the role of the deacon is to protect the prayer of the priest, which I certainly found to be very meaningful when at the time he spoke to me, I was a deacon. What else a deacon can do varies widely. The primary service of a deacon in the Orthodox Church today is liturgical. Historically, deacons served in many, many ways, in administration, in charity, in education, and so on and so on. Now, typically a deacon will have an additional focus, but it will be one that depends more on their own talents. What are they able to bring and lead and go with? Perhaps it will be education. Perhaps it would be music. And there's many, many more besides, in addition to the liturgical. But I should also say that even that is not necessarily required. But I have noticed that it's very common. The ordination rite is structurally different for a deacon as opposed to a subdeacon or a reader. Very much more similar to A, priests, and B, those getting married. Yeah, southern twist, right? So it happens during the liturgy. I think it's very significant that it happens after the consecration, because a deacon doesn't consecrate. And that's what this choice of location is indicating. A deacon is ordained after the consecration, They're led by subdeacons. The man will be a subdeacon at this point, but led by other subdeacons to the altar. There's a procession around the table 3 times with the same hymns that are sung at the wedding service. It simply happens that the procession is around the altar instead of around the central icon like you would see at a wedding. The only difference is that there's a slightly different order. There's a proclamation of the ordination. There's 2 prayers. One is to ordain. The second is for strength in fulfilling what the new deacon has been ordained to. And then the lead deacon also prays for the ordinand. And then at the end, probably the signature piece of an ordination, the various vestments are shown to the people by the bishop with the proclamation that the ordinand is worthy. And that's where you may be familiar with the word axios being used, which is translated worthy. And this will be repeated and sung many, many times for each of the vestments that a deacon will have. The second major order is that of the priesthood. A priest is set aside to serve on behalf of a bishop by administering a parish and by tending to the believers in that parish. Like you guys. The normative place of a priest ought be the altar, either leading or assisting in worship. As we know, there are various ranks of the priesthood. Things like mitred archpriest, protopresbyter, archimandrite would be right at the top. Then archpriest, and this one's a fun one. It can be hegumen or igumen or abbot. Each of these are direct translations. That's the middle rank, the same kind of rank as archpriest. And then you have the priest or the hieromonk. And when we talk about what a priest is for, it's sometimes helpful to contrast this. Some will be familiar with terms like minister or pastor. And so why do we use the term priest? It is true that a priest does pastor. He guides the flock. He leads them to where they should be. It is true that a priest does minister. He binds the wounds of life. He encourages and uplifts his people. It is true that a priest does preach and is in that sense a preacher. He teaches. He exhorts. It's worth noting that each of these terms, pastor, minister, preacher, each of these terms are fundamentally human-centric. And, well, the priest is called for something slightly different. What distinguishes and why we use the term priest, why we use the term father, is because a priest will look on his flock as children of the Lord that he has begotten through the gospel. That a priest will lead his people in worship. That a priest will offer the sacraments, connecting us with Christ's sacrifice on the cross, and more. And that a priest will act to connect his people with God, to try his best to be that bridge for the people. This is why we say priest and call him father, because we're identifying what is true. The structure of the ordination, very, very similar to the ordination to the diaconate, is during the Divine Liturgy, after the great entrance, that is before the anaphora, before the consecration of communion. But other than that, you have the same idea. The deacons will lead him up. There's a procession around the altar table 3 times with the same hymns. There's the proclamation of his ordination. There's 2 prayers, first to ordain, second for strength in fulfilling this ordination. The lead priest will pray for the ordinand, lead priest instead of lead deacon, but same kind of idea. And then the vestments are shown to the people. So the vestments are different for a priest. The different vestments are different, I should say. So the orarion is removed, replaced with a stole. The belt is shown. The cuffs will just stay on. The phelonium is shown. The pectoral cross in our tradition is also shown and given. And each of these are shown to the people who proclaim once again that the ordinand is axios, is worthy. Later on, there's the last part and another unique part for the priest. The newly ordained is given what we call the pledge. And this pledge is the lamb. There's a special line during the service, but the priest is given this just to hold. As it reminds the priest that, it reminds the priest that he's accountable for this, that he's accountable to steward the gifts with great precision, that he's accountable not only as a pharmacist might be accountable for what they prescribe, but to the God of all. The last of these major orders is bishop. A bishop is set aside to administer their diocese, to teach, and to ordain. They're set aside to rightly divide the word of truth. That's their purpose. That's what they're set aside for. Their normative place, we'll find them in the altar or otherwise leading services or overseeing worship. You may see a throne in various parts of the church. You may see this either at the head of the altar, immediately behind the altar in the center. You may see this in the center of the church, or you may see this if you're looking at the altar, the right-hand side of the altar, depending on the liturgical tradition. Where you might see him, let's say if our bishop came to our church, this throne would be either in the center of the church or in the middle of the altar facing out, facing to the people. This is where he stands to oversee worship, to see that worship is being done decently and in order. The structure of the ordination of a bishop, would you believe, is pretty much exactly the same. There is an election as bishop of a place. That is unique. There is a threefold confession of faith that occurs. And we've referred to that threefold confession of faith in other parts of our catechism course. But he is ordained during the divine liturgy after the hymn Holy God, after the Trisagion in that part of the liturgy. So right at the start, because that's how he begins. He is there to lead services and to be the fount from which others can lead services. Priests have their authority through their bishop. One priest without a bishop is no priest at all. He will be at the ordination, he will be led by priest to the altar. The gospel is opened over the ordinand's head, and then the hands will go on that gospel. Then the proclamation of the ordination, the two prayers to ordain for strength in the ordination. Another bishop will pray for the ordinand. The vestments are shown to the people who proclaim that he is axios and worthy. And later he will be led to the throne and entrusted with a pastoral staff. We see this as ceremonial sometimes, but a pastoral staff is there for a reason. Why is it that shepherds have a staff? To guide the sheep, and sometimes to pull them back because they're going the wrong way. So this staff has meaning. So these are the orders of ordination within the Orthodox Church. Another section of the church is monasticism. And I suppose that the best way to see monasticism is to see it up close. But I know that in Queensland that's a little challenging. We are unfortunately missing something by not having a monastery up here. We're a little thin on the ground for monastics at all up here. But a monastic tonsure is how it is that a person will become a monastic. It requires someone wishing to become a monastic. It requires a abbot or abbess to agree. A abbot for a monk, a abbess for a nun. There's a number of stages So typically the first stage for someone who's discerning their a calling to monasticism or their wish to devote their life to monasticism. And the first step is to see what it actually is, to go there for yourself. You find out that it's not singing hymns all day. You find out that there's a lot of work involved, outer and inner. That you can't flee from people by going to a monastery. In fact, it's kind of worse because you're around the same people every day. So just like a family life, you're going to grate on each other occasionally. And that's okay. That's a part of sanding ourselves to come a little closer to Christ. So visiting, what we might call postulancy, what is also translated as worker. So someone chooses to live there for a while with the permission of the monastic community and their own wish. There will be a time where a person is made a novice, where they're given some of the monastic vow, but not all. This is where people are called brother such and such or sister so and so. After this is the Rasafor stage, which literally means someone who bears the cassock. And so they'll be wearing the monastic cassock and the monastic hat, the klobuk. They'll be called father such and such or mother so and so. Somewhere around the Rasafor stage is the commitment point, where it becomes a lifelong commitment. At novice, it is not. And the small schema, it certainly is. The small schema being the next stage, and this is where one takes one's first vows. After this is the great schema. In our particular tradition, the great schema is usually done closer to the end of life. Close to the end of life after many years of bearing the small schema. Another part of monasticism is that there is a leader of the community called abbot or abbess for male monastic communities and female monastic communities. And this person will be installed by their bishop. We don't have monastic orders in the Orthodox Church. What we do have is monasteries within a diocese. There are, needless to say, different, I suppose, flavors of monasticism. Different monasteries will have a different vibe about them. They'll have different inspirations. Balaam will be distinct from Optina, will be distinct from Mount Athos, will be distinct from Ordomelia, will be distinct from all sorts of places. But each is within their particular diocese, and that this is where accountability comes in. What is common to monastics and laity is that each must work to bring themselves to salvation, must work to bring others to salvation, must be a witness to the wider community in following Christ. How each of those are defined may vary. If we're in Wollongabba right now, our wider community is quite different to if, for example, there was a community out in Longreach. But nonetheless, whatever wider community happens to be there is how we're able to show our witness, where we're able to light our candle. There is very little that separates a monastic from a layperson, other than the vows made. Though a normative difference would be the intensity in which a monastic would be going. There's a number of different stories of monastics, and it'll be, for example, things like they'll be weaving baskets. We'll find them in Egypt in many centuries ago. Weaving baskets, going down to the market, selling them, and they knew how much budget they had that day. And once they got there, everything else, you can have it. Or you can have it for tuppence. So there's very little that divides the two necessarily. That we can be sanctified in the world is something that we know. Aside from the sacraments, there's a limited amount that separates a clergy from laity. Aside from the sacraments, aside from inside the church building service, each of us are still called to holiness. Each of us are still called to the highest calling that we can possibly have. Holiness and sanctity. There is no greater title than saint. Not father, not mother, not brother, not reverend, most respected, right reverend, saint. And that's what we're called to. All of us have a vocation to love God. Different people have different means in which they do this, but all of us have the same goal. I've spoken about how many different ways there are to be serving. And it's time that we turn our attention to lay service, to this part of the church militant. So let's start with, I suppose, clergy adjacent role, that of the wives of clergy. We may sometimes call them matuszki, or one of a whole bunch of different names. So there's two basic ways that the terms are translated. Either mother, which kind of works. If you've got father such and such, you have mother so and so. The problem with saying mother such and such is, then it sounds like she's a monastic in English, which is rather unfortunate. We've yet to find a good English translation that's really caught on. I have ideas and none of them have caught on. So it could be mother such and such, and that's where matuszka comes from. Or it could be derived from the word presbyter. So that's where presbytera comes from. That would be the Greek translation. The best Englishification of that would be presbyteress. It's a bit wordy, kind of doesn't quite make it out. Anyway, that's why we don't quite have a translation, which is why you'll hear me referring to matuszka in reference to my own wife, even though neither of us speak the language in any sense. And we should note that the wives of clergy are respected for the burden that they carry, a burden that is often unseen. When we ask the question, clergy look after the people, but who looks after the clergy? It's usually their wives, which is its own great burden. And if I may, it's an important thing that we don't add to that burden by going, the priest is busy, but the wife is basically the same person, so I'll just chuck it on them. That's not right. And I'm confident that the people that I'm speaking to aren't going to do that. But nonetheless, to offer that respect, to offer that friendship is very, very important. There are administrative roles. Roles on the parish council are probably the most well-known of these. So the parish council is tasked with aiding in administering the parish church. The rector, that is the priest that's assigned to head a parish, he runs meetings and he represents the parish to the diocese and or to the government as required, to outside of the parish. The warden is there for maintenance for the building and grounds. The secretary for administrative duties. The treasurer for financial matters. Other clergy who are assigned to a parish, an assistant priest or a deacon, so it's only major orders. But other clergy are there to assist the rector. And other councillors may be elected as well, and are frequently elected as well. And so a parish councillor is there to, long story short, to pick up the slack, where others may be busy with their own roles and with their own portfolios. Other parish councillors are able to be tasked with specific roles, are able to pick up the slack, are able to assist with decision making. A common feature of a parish is the parish auxiliary. This can be called the sisterhood, this can be called by a number of terms. And their role primarily is in beautifying the church, where a warden would be tasked with the outside of a church. The auxiliary, the sisterhood, would be tasked with typically the inside of the church, making it beautiful. We have liturgical roles, which are filled by laity. We have altar servers, who are there to serve at the altar, to ensure that everything goes as it should. They are performing the role of what used to be a tonsured person, what used to be a clergyman. It is standard and the common practice that it is no longer a tonsured person. Yet nonetheless, any altar server should be carrying themselves with the dignity that someone tonsured to their role ought to carry. Likewise, the choir. The choir is also put into this same position where it was where each chorister would have been tonsured as a singer. And so the choir is there to represent the congregation in prayer. You must be very aware of the work that they're doing and its gravity and importance. The candle desk is not quite liturgical, but I suppose it's kind of close. The candle desk is the first place of meeting newcomers typically. Some places will have a welcoming team of some kind, which would be outside of the church. But after a person walks into the church, typically they're turning towards the candle desk. And so the role of someone at the candle desk is to assist people transition from outside the world to in here, the sacred. It's a very important place as well. Our parish has I'm trying to count quickly, but just take my word for it, it's a lot of ministries. This can range, and different parishes will have different roles that can be done in all sorts of different organizational structures. But to give you an idea, things like coffee hour would be here, charity would be here, a bookstore, the various fellowship groups, making Prospero. Each of these can be done, and more can be done by laity, and are very much needed in parish life. There are other roles too. With all the talk of service, it would be wrong for us to ignore the service of just showing up, to ignore the role of being a parishioner. Each of us, as people called out and journeying together in this particular community, are going to be worshipping together as a group in a community. We're not always going to necessarily 100% get along with everyone. We're not always going to be of each and every thought together. We are united in our theology. We are united in the direction that we're going. We may disagree about things. We may disagree about this or that political issue. We may disagree about which party one should vote for or what idea should take preeminence. That's normal. That's normal in parish life. Some we will resonate with. We will think they're lovely. They seem to be following the Christian life well. We want to spend more time with them. Some will make you appreciate the lovely ones that you want to spend more time with. And this will be different for different people, and that's totally fine. We're called to love one another. We're called not to be in hatred. Be as much as possible like that first group. Like that first group that are hospitable, that are welcoming, that are inviting, that see the newcomer and welcome them in, that see the one sitting without anyone with them, and engage to bring them in, to bring the community to them. After all, where was it that Christ went? Did he sit in the temple and wait for the people to come to him? A bit, but often. And I would say, in fact, someone went through and did the numbers, all the interactions. most of his interactions were with outsiders. He was not in the temple waiting for the nations to come to him. And so when the nations do come, it's part of the job of each and every one of us to be the ones to welcome. Other people within a parish are our catechumens, our inquirers. The role of catechumens and inquirers is to learn, to be formed. The role is to learn and not to teach. The role is to learn. So when people ask, and I have no doubt that maybe not every, but pretty close, pretty much every inquirer and catechumen has been asked, why? Why do this? You know, other churches you can sit down. Why do this? And when people ask, if they ask, we are able to share our experience. We are able to recommend resources. But it would be foolhardy to presume to teach. Tap in others who are teachers. I read this article, maybe it would help. I read this book, maybe it would help. But for those who are still learning the faith, one can only share what one has received. And so sharing our experience, this is beneficial. To teach is to go beyond the role of a catechumen or an inquirer. It is commonly stated that there are two different groups. This is becoming less and less helpful as time goes by, but that's a topic for a whole different talk. The idea of cradles and converts. It is a normal descriptive term, and it does describe something that in its right context can be rather helpful. There are a number of prejudices that go along with this, a number of stereotypes that go along with this. The idea that converts are exemplary Orthodox, and little is said about cradles, but you can infer. This is a myth. It's a fictional myth. The reality is much more humility-inducing. The reality is that each of us are striving. Each of us are struggling together. Each person's life will have their own benefits that each are able to share with one another. I know one person would tell me repeatedly a number of times that converts this and we're bringing so much, whereas we cradles, etc., etc. And after a couple of times, I took it on myself to correct, to say that's not the case. Each need the other. Each need the other. That lived experience is gold, just as the theoretical knowledge is, so long as they are together. And so we learn from one another. So we have parishioners, we have catechumens and inquirers, and we have visitors. All are normal parts of parish life. All are welcomed, all are part of the community. And if we don't see it, we make this happen. If we see someone who's left out, bring them in. Now, when it comes to how do we put this into practice, there's a number of things that I'm going to be talking about. How do we serve in our parish? How do we serve? How would we consider monastic service? How would we consider clerical service? And I'm just going to talk about some first steps, because second steps are unnecessary, as in for us to talk about. First steps for serving in your parish. Now, different priests will suggest different things, but this is what this priest is suggesting. For serving in your parish, firstly, have a chat to your priest. Because he would love to hear from you. He would love to hear that. Now, my first question would probably be, how would you like to serve? I'd probably say, here's our list of ministries. Is there one that particularly speaks to you? Is there one that particularly resonates, that you go, yes, I would like to? Some people have already had this experience, I can see. Now, if you're starting with, how would I like to serve? Then that's going to be a way that you can say, that you can devote yourself to. It is very easy to take on too much. It is very easy to say, I can do this, 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 and this. And that's no doubt true, but probably not at the same time. And so, as a general rule for volunteers, I would talk about how one person should be in charge of no more than one ministry. One person should be involved in no more than 3 ministries. And a proviso that raising a young child is a ministry in itself. From everything that I've heard about it, it's a bit tough. This cannot be overvalued, how important parenting children is. We don't realize that this is a form of passing our faith on. That when we're looking to our future, it's the hours and upon hours that are put in by parents that make this possible. It's not the only part, but it's a huge part. And so that's why it is that commonly parents with young families, well, they're busy. And rightfully busy. For each stage of life, there is a season. So folks who are our young adults, who are single, who are wanting to involve themselves, fantastic. There's a role there. Folks who have married, have children, raising children, there's a role there too. Empty nesters whose children have left, there's a role there too. There's a role for us all. As Paul puts it, we don't despise our eyes don't despise our legs because they're not eyes. We're all needed all together. So for those wanting to serve in a parish, speak to your priest. Think about how you would like to serve, and be in periodic contact with your priest. Perhaps there's a way that work can be improved or more aligned with the direction of the parish. Perhaps there's a way where one's work can be more streamlined. Maybe there's a portion that really doesn't need to be done and that there's a more efficient way of doing something. And if there's resources that you need, speak to your priest. Or speak to the person who's responsible for that ministry. These are ways of ensuring that our time serving Christ is at its optimal. Now, first steps for discerning monasticism. Once again, different priests will suggest different things, and this is what this priest is suggesting. Also, I should say, if you are married, you have already discerned this. There's no leaving your marriage and going to a monastery. That's not the done thing. That's not how we do it. So, if we are discerning monasticism, then we speak to our priest privately. We try to avoid sharing this around. Very, very small groups should know about this. We should be asking to be involved in our parish, especially in parish ministry areas that others don't want to do. Because you'll find out when you visit a monastery, that's what novices are tasked with first. tasked with looking after things, the things that we don't necessarily want to do because we're setting the will to one side in a monastery. We want to be arranging a visit, at least overnight. We'll perhaps want a longer visit, a longer pilgrimage, a few days. And at that point, we're going to be speaking to the abbot or abbess or whoever the responsible person is at the monastery. We should, one would expect some time to pass before an invitation. This isn't right, good, you're interested, you're in. Just like we don't do that for people preparing for baptism. Expect to learn a career. This will be useful regardless. I've known all sorts of people who have used their career to great benefit in the monastic life. Some off the top of my head were lawyers. That came in very handy when they needed a lawyer. Some worked with the environment, environmental protection and so on. Came in very handy when they needed a groundskeeper. Some worked as a painter. Iconography is kind of necessary. So, one discerning monasticism should continue with their studies. They'll be bringing that to the community. And in addition to making a pilgrimage and speaking with the monastics there, build connections with a monastery or multiple monasteries. It's possible that a person will say, this monastery isn't my cup of tea, but I still want to be a monastic. And so perhaps you'll visit a different monastery. First steps for discerning clerical service. Once again, speak to one's priest privately. Once again, we shouldn't be making this a topic of discussion. It should be something that one discerns. Hopefully, by the time, if everything goes to plan, if everything does, then everyone will find it not a shock. But it doesn't need to be something that's a topic of conversation. One should ask to be involved in one's parish, testing a vocation through liturgical worship, and once again through community service in the areas that, especially in the areas that others don't want to do. One should expect some time to pass, both for age and for time after baptism. One should expect to learn a career, because reality, it will probably be voluntary service. And one should plan to speak with one's priest at regular intervals. Hopefully this is planned. Like perhaps he'll say, good, be involved, and I'll speak to you after this amount of time. But this is something that's beneficial to speak to one's priest about. Another thing, because this is a catechetical course, it's not uncommon that that those converting, particularly young males, will be thinking their vocation is possible. This is not uncommon. What sorts a vocation from a thought is time. Time is the main thing. So there will be reasons why now is not right, but knowing that clerical service is a lifelong commitment, we don't rush into this. Knowing the lifelong commitment to a community, one wants to make sure that one wishes to serve in that community, to serve in that particular way. And so that's why it is that we don't rush into anything. We don't rush into monasticism, we don't rush into clerical service, just like we don't rush into baptism. To conclude, there's many ways that we are able to serve, liturgically, administratively, in support, in leadership, and more. Our church leaders are set apart to sacred duties for life, whether this is in liturgical roles at the altar or in reading, whether leading worship and being that bridge between laity and priest, whether to offer the sacraments and lead the flock to Christ, or whether to administer and rightly divide the word of truth from falsehood. All are working together to build up the body of Christ. And if we want to serve, ask your priest. Now, before we get to question time, I have questions for you. So hopefully this will be my, validation that my teaching has been learnt. So that my goal for what we were going to learn about has been achieved. So, who can answer? What is the Sacrament of Ordination? Who can raise their hand? I never stop being a teacher, do I?
Is it just like liturgy? Isn't someone during liturgy?
What is the Sacrament of Ordination? So you've answered when is the Sacrament of Ordination, which was the fifth question. So that's good. Ordination happens in or around liturgy. Yes.
The Sacrament of Ordination is a lifelong commitment to serve the church and parishioners.
Good. That sort of answers why does the church ordain people, doesn't it? One of those comprehensive answers. Who is able to be ordained?
Men.
That is true, but incomplete.
Depends on the role that you want to be ordained to.
It does depend on the role, yes. The big difference in roles is marital status. If one is intending to then get married, then they can only go so far. Any others?
Be Christian in good standing.
That is kind of important, isn't it? But absolutely. Any others? Age, yeah. There's various minimums, 20 for subdeacon, 25 for deacon, 30 for priest, 35 for bishop. These are the canonical minimums. Sometimes that's a rule that's more bent than others because a person will grow out of that impediment after all.
Willing and able to engage in reason.
Yes, willing and able to engage in the community. There's not a lot of point being ordained because you like fancy dress, because you can just sew that. But to serve wanting to serve a community is vital. Who is able to ordain?
Bishops?
Yeah, that's about it. There is a provision that exists for a archpriest for a abbot to ordain a reader in his monastery. That's wildly specific. Yeah.
Does this include monks?
Monastics are able to be tonsured by any priest who has. I'm trying to remember because it's not something that I typically do. Monastics are able to be tonsured by a monastic of a similar or higher rank of monasticism. They must also be a priest. Or you get the bishop in. And it doesn't matter what rank a bishop is tonsured to, he is able to do the tonsuring himself.
Is that what a hieromonk is?
A hieromonk is a priest monk. Yeah. Hierodeacon, deacon monk. Hire a deacon is another service entirely.
That's way to get around it.
So what are the two minor orders of clergy? Yes.
Reader and subdeacon.
Good. What does a reader do?
Read.
Read.
Read liturgical text.
In church.
Read liturgical texts in church. Good. And subdeacon? If anyone says subdeact, I will not. What does a subdeacon do?
Serve the bishop in hierarchical services.
Yes. And when the bishop isn't there?
Isn't it like the guy between the clergy? That's a deacon. Whoops.
That's a deacon. Yeah.
They make sure that the parish is praying so that the priest can focus on the prayers done for consecration.
That's what I meant.
And the whole service in general.
Closer to a deacon, that one. Subdeacon?
Making sure the altar service runs smoothly.
Yeah. Making sure the altar runs smoothly. So that can be cleaning, that can be changing vestments, and that can be supervising altar service.
And they can touch the
That was,
the sacred
Yes.
objects and
That's right.
Yeah.
So they're very, very useful for like cleaning the said sacred objects. Three major orders. And what do they do? So who's got the first one? What it is and what do they do? Yep.
Deacon, they're the one that ensures that the parish is praying peacefully and correctly, as well as allowing the priests to serve in the altar
Good.
without distraction.
And priest?
Offers the sacrament of communion and leads the flock.
Well, all the sacraments.
Yeah, sure.
Almost.
That's
Yeah.
ordination.
Good.
That one's
And what about the last one? Yes.
Bishop.
Good. What does a bishop do?
Leads the other clergy, like the priests,
So liturgy.
serves the diocese.
Serves the diocese, yeah. So that's in a number of ways, like administration, but also to guide the priests in their various parishes. Good. If one thinks that they wish to discern a calling of some kind, what's their first thing that they do according to me? Yes. Thank you.
tell everyone.
And the church militant. Define the church militant. What is it in one sentence? Yes.
Orthodox Christians here on earth.
Good. What's the other term that we church triumphant? And what's that?
the saints and
Good.
all of the heavenly realm.
All that. We might say that the Feast of the Church Triumphant is the Sunday after Pentecost, which is Sunday of All Saints.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's formally anywhere, but it might make a handy mnemonic. What are some ways that we in the Church Militant are able to serve?
Prospera.
You're looking for volunteers? Yes?
Always.
They can serve in various ministries or the sisterhood. They can serve on parish council after they've got a bit of experience. They can welcome, there's all kinds of things that they can discuss with their priest.
Good.
Altar servers and the choir.
Good.
Spreading the gospel in their communities by being good members of the faith.
Good. And a whole bunch of others, shall we? Yeah. Awesome. And how does being a part of the Church Militant impact your life?
Makes it busier.
I mean, you're not wrong. One and then two.
It holds you to a standard and you're continuously trying to improve yourself and your community.
Fantastic. And yourself?
Well, personally, I can only speak, but it anchors me to something that is greater than myself. And so I'm participating, but I'm contributing, and that kind of develops something that's really whole in me as a person developmentally. So
Awesome. And last one?
And struggling against sin and striving for holiness, I suppose.
Fantastic. It's all part of that journey. All right, so that's our quiz. It sounds like that we achieved my goal, which is fantastic. I've got a bit of homework for you all. I always have homework, don't you worry about that. Once a teacher. This homework is to consider some ways that you can be of service in your parish. I know that some of you will be already serving, and that's fantastic. And others are looking for ways to serve, and that's also very good. So what are some ways that you're able to serve within your parish? That's my homework task for this talk. Thank you all very much for being here, for listening, for being a part of this talk.